I remember when this case broke. I was living in Staffordshire at the time. The headlines, the horror, the disbelief, it was everywhere. You couldn't walk past a newsstand or turn on TV without seeing the house, 25 Cromwell Street. The patio, the cellar, the faces of the victims, and the cold, blank stare of Rose West. It wasn't just a crime story, it was a national reckoning. And even now, decades later, the story of Fred and Rose West remains one of the darkest chapters in British criminal history. In the quiet town of Gloucestershire, England, a modest house stood at 25 Cromwell Street. To passersby, it was unremarkable, but behind its walls a nightmare unfolded, one that would shock the nation and refine the meaning of evil. This is the story of Fred and Rose West. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred and Rose West carried out a series of murders so disturbing, so methodical, concealed that it was decades before the full scale of their crimes came to light. Their victims were young women, some strangers, some family, many of whom were subjected to sexual abuse, torture, ultimately murder. The West buried their victims beneath floorboards, in the cellar, and in the garden of their home. That house, 25 Cromwell Street, would later be known as the House of Horrors. Fred West was born in 1941 in Herefordshire. His early life was shaped by poverty, violence and disturbing family dynamics. He left school with very few qualifications and quickly developed a reputation for manipulation and cruelty. Rose Letts, born in 1953, had her own troubled upbringing. She met Fred when she was just 15. By 16, she was living with him, helping raise his children from a previous marriage. Together, they formed a partnership that would become one of the most deprived in British criminal history. Their crimes began with the murder of Anne McFall, Fred's former nanny, who was pregnant with his child. From there, the pattern escalated. Victims included lodgers, hitchhikers, and even their own children. Carmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter, was murdered by Rose. Heather West, their biological daughter, was buried under the patio. In total, 12 victims were confirmed, though Fred hinted at many more. The couple operated with chilling normalcy. They maintained a facade of domestic life, even as they lured young women into their home under the guise of offering lodgings or employment. Many were never seen again. The West used methods of bondage, mutilations and psychological control. Fred often dismembered the bodies, burying them in shallow graves and pouring concrete over their remains. It wasn't until 1994 that the truth began to surface. A grim family joke. Fred, telling his children they'll end up under the patio like Heather, reached social workers. That comment triggered a police investigation. Excavations at 25 Cromwell Street revealed Heather's remains, followed by 9 more bodies. Fred and Rose were arrested. Fred confessed to multiple murders but died by suicide in prison before the trial. Rose stood trial alone and was convicted of 10 murders. The trial was harrowing. Witnesses included Fred's daughter, Anne-Marie, who described years of sexual abuse. Caroline Owens, a former nanny who escaped the West, testified about her abduction and assault. Rose showed little emotion in court, except when Heather was mentioned. Whether her reaction was genuine or performative remains unclear. 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The site remains vacant, a silent memorial to the victims. The case exposed deep failures in social services and law enforcement, promoting reforms in child protection and missing person investigations. This story is not just about murder, it's about control, silence, and the terrifying ability of evil to hide in plain sight. Fred and Rose West were not monsters in the shadows. They were parents, neighbours, employers, and for years they got away with it. To understand how the horrors of Cromwell Street came to be, we need to go back to the childhood of Fred and Rose West, because evil doesn't just appear overnight. It grows, it festers, and in their case, it finds fertile ground. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, in Much, Miracle, Herefordshire. He was the first surviving child of Walter and Daisy West, farm labourers who lived in poverty and isolation. The family moved to Moorcroft Cottage in 1946, a small, electric-free home heated by a log fire. Fred's upbringing was strict, and rumours of incest and sexual abuse surrounded the household. Fred later claimed his father taught him that incest was acceptable, saying, "I made you, so I'm entitled to have you." Whether this was true or fabrication, it speaks volumes about the environment he grew up in. Fred was a poor student. He left school at 15, nearly illiterate, and began working as a farmhand. He was known as a mama's boy, protected fiercely by his mother, and mocked by peers for his appearance and behaviour. At 17, he suffered a serious motorcycle accident that left him in a coma and required a metal plate in his head. Some believe this injury contributed to his later impulsivity and violent outbursts. Fred's early relationships were marked by aggression. He pursued women relentlessly and was accused of sexually assaulting his younger sister Kitty, who claimed he raped and impregnated her. Again, whether this was true or not, it foreshadowed the disturbing trajectory of his adult life. Rosemary Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Northam, Devon. Her father, Bill Letts, was a paranoid schizophrenic and a disciplinarian. Rose was known for violent mood swings and erratic behaviour from a young age. She was reportedly sexually abused by her father, and by her teens she was already showing signs of cruelty, especially towards her siblings. At 15, Rose met Fred West at a bus stop in Cheltenham. He was 27, with 2 children and a criminal record. Despite the age gap and Fred's troubled past, Rose was drawn to him. She soon moved into his home and began working as his nanny to his children. Their relationship quickly turned romantic, and by 1972 they were married. Fred and Rose's relationship was built on dominance and control. Rose became an active participant in Fred's sexual abuse of young women, including his own daughters. She was not coerced, she was complicit. In fact, she often initiated the abuse. Together they created an environment of terror, where violence was normalised and cruelty was routine. Their first known murder as a couple was that of Charmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter, in 1971. Fred was in prison at the time, and Rose killed the child alone. Shortly after, Fred murdered his first wife, Rena Costello. These killings marked the beginning of a spree that would span nearly 2 decades. Looking back, it's clear that Fred and Rose West were shaped by trauma, abuse and dysfunctionality. But they didn't just repeat the cycle, they escalated it. They became predators, hiding behind the mask of domestic life, and the house at 25 Cromwell Street became their hunting ground. Fred and Rose West moved into 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucestershire shortly after their wedding in January 1972. It was a modest 3-storey terraced house at the end of the row, with an alleyway leading to a nearby shopping square. Outwardly, it was unremarkable, but inside, it became a fortress of abuse, a trap for the vulnerable, and ultimately a burial ground. They converted the upper floors into bedsits, renting rooms to lodgers and runaways. It gave them a steady stream of potential victims. The family lived on the ground floor, and Fred installed a cooker and wash basin on the first floor landing to keep lodgers from accessing the kitchen or rear garden. Privacy wasn't just about boundaries, it was about control. Rose began engaging in sex work from the house. One room was fitted with peepholes and a baby monitor. Fred used to watch her with clients, but this wasn't just voyeurism, It was part of a larger pattern of domination and sadism. Behind closed doors, the basement was transformed into a torture chamber. After the killings, Fred dismembered the bodies. He removed limbs, sometimes heads, and buried the remains in shallow graves beneath the floorboards, in the cellar and in the garden. He poured concrete over the burial sites, sealing them into the fabric of the house. In some cases, he left personal items, jewellery, clothing buried with the victims. When police began excavating the property in 1994, they found 9 bodies. 3 were buried in the garden, including Heather West, Fred and Rose's own daughter. 6 more were discovered in the cellar. The remains were often incomplete, and many showed signs of sexual trauma and blunt force injuries. What struck investigators most wasn't just the brutality, it was the juxtaposition. Children's drawings were still taped to cellar walls. Toys were scattered near burial sites. The Wests lived among the dead, raising children in the same rooms where they tortured and murdered others. It was domestic life laid over horror. Fred kept trophies. He photographed victims before and after death. He stored body parts in bags and boxes. Rose, too, was active. She participated in the abuse, sometimes initiating it. Survivors described her as more violent than Fred, more unpredictable. In 1996, 26 Cromwell Street was demolished. The debris was destroyed, and a sidewalk was laid over the site. No memorial was placed, only silence. The house had become too infamous, too contaminated by its history. Today it exists only in photographs, court records, and the memories of those who survived. But for over 20 years it stood as a monument to the unchecked evil. Fred and Rose West used it to lure, trap and destroy, and they did it while pretending to be ordinary. A couple with children, a home and a life. The façade is what made it so terrifying. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred and Rose West murdered at least 12 young women and girls. Each victim had a name, a story, and a life that was brutally cut short. What follows is a chronicle account of those lives, remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were. Anne was Fred's former nanny and romantic partner. She was young, vulnerable and pregnant with Fred's child when she vanished. Her dismembered remains were later discovered in a field near Much Moracle, Herefordshire. Though never officially charged, Fred was the prime suspect. The cause of death was suspected stabbing, followed by dismemberment. Rena was Fred's first wife and mother of Charmaine. She disappeared after trying to reclaim her child from Fred and Rose. Her remains were found in a letterbox field, Kimberley. She had been strangled. Her death marked the silencing of a woman who tried to protect her daughter. Charmaine was Fred's stepdaughter from Rennie's previous relationship. She was murdered by Rose while Fred was serving time in prison. Her body was buried at Midland Road in Gloucestershire. The cause of death was never conclusively determined, but evidence pointed to strangulation or blunt force trauma. She was just a child. Linda was a lodger at Cromwell Street. She was last seen visiting the Wests. Her family told she had moved away, but her body was later found buried in the cellar. She had been strangled, had her body mutated post-mortem. Her fingernails had been removed, her jaw was bound with tape. Carol was abducted while walking home from the cinema in Worcester. Her remains were found in the cellar. She had been strangled, and there were signs of sexual assault. Her body was bound and wrapped in plastic. Lucy was a university student from Cheltenham. She disappeared while waiting for a bus. Her remains were found in the cellar. She had been stabbed and dismembered. Her death occurred just days after Christmas. Her cousin, novelist Martin Amis, later wrote about her in his memoir. Teresa was a Swiss student hitchhiking to Ireland. She was last seen in London. Her body was found in the cellar. She had been strangled and dismembered. Her remains were buried with care, as if to conceal the brutality of her death. Shirley was a schoolgirl from Rochester. Her body was found with her head entirely wrapped in tape. Plastic tube inserted into her nose to keep her breathing during torture. She was buried in the cellar. Her cause of death was asphyxiation. The cruelty she endured defies comprehension. The adjunta had previously lived with West as a lodger. She disappeared while staying in Newitt, Gloucestershire. Her body was found in the cellar. She had been strangled. Her remains showed signs of prolonged abuse. Shirley was a lodger and Fred's lover. She was pregnant with his child when she vanished. Her body was buried in the garden. The cause of death remains unknown, but her remains showed signs of mutilation. Her unborn child died with her. Alison was originally from Swansea. She had moved to Gloucestershire and was last seen in the area. Her body was buried in the garden. She had been strangled. Her death marked the last known sexual motivated killing before the Wests turned inward. Heather was Fred and Rose's biological daughter. She had endured years of abuse before she was murdered and buried under the patio. Her disappearance triggered the investigation that finally exposed the Wests. Fred had joked to his children that Heather was under the patio, a comment that provided horrifyingly true. These 12 victims are the ones we know. Fred hinted at many more. He claimed responsibility for the murder of Mary Bastelholm, a 15-year-old girl who vanished in 1968. Her body was never found. The true number of victims may never be known. But in this video, we remember them, not as statistics, not as footnotes, but as lives stolen by cruelty, buried by silence, and finally brought to light. Not everyone who entered 25 Cromwell Street was murdered. A few escaped, and their stories, though harrowing, helped expose the truth. These survivors lived among the dead, endured abuse, and ultimately found the strength to speak out. Kathleen Richards, lodger, age 17. Kathleen Richards moved into Cromwell Street in 1977 with her older sister Deirdre and Deirdre's infant son. They were desperate for housing and accepted a room offered by Fred and Rose. For 14 months, Kathleen lived in the House of Horrors, unaware of its true nature. Fred molested her repeatedly, squeezing her as she passed on the stairs, climbing into her bed at night. He drilled peepholes into her bedroom wall to watch her sleep. Kathleen and her sister stuffed newspaper into the holes, only to find it removed the next morning. That was a moment she knew something was deeply wrong. In January 1979, Kathleen and Deirdre packed their few belongings and left. They had no idea what they were escaping from. Years later, Kathleen learned that her friend and fellow lodger, Shirley Robinson, had been murdered, 8 months pregnant with Fred's child. Caroline Owens, nanny, age 16. Caroline Jean Owens was hitchhiking home in 1972 when Fred and Rose offered her a lift. She confided in them about her troubled home life. They offered her a job as a live-in nanny. She accepted. At first, Caroline thought she'd found a safe place, but soon Fred and Rose began making inappropriate comments. Rose was engaged in sex work from inside the house. Caroline felt increasingly unsafe and decided to leave. On December 6, 1972, Fred and Rose offered her another lift. She accepted, hoping to avoid conflict, but during the ride, Fred struck her violently. She was abducted, sexually assaulted, and psychologically manipulated into returning as their nanny. Eventually, she escaped and reported the abuse to the police. Her testimony later became a cornerstone of Rose's trial. Anne Marie West, daughter and witness. Anne Marie was Fred's biological daughter and one of the earliest victims of sexual abuse inside the home. She later testified in court about years of rape and psychological control. Her courage helped convict Rose West. Anne-Marie described being forced to participate in sexual acts from the age of 8. She was threatened, isolated, and told that silence was survival. Her testimony was graphic, painful, and essential to revealing the full scope of the West's crimes. These survivors endured unimaginable trauma, but their voices, once silenced, became the key to justice. Their accounts helped dismantle the facade of domestic normacy and expose the true horrors of 25 Cromwell Street. In 1992, the West family was already under scrutiny. 5 of Fred's and Rose's children had been removed from their home under emergency protection orders. They were placed temporarily at Crowley Manor in Cheltenham, where social workers began interviewing them. It was during one of these interviews that a child made a chilling aside. A family joke, they said, about Heather being under the patio. At the time, the comment was dismissed. There was no formal complaint, and Heather's whereabouts were yet not a priority. By the spring of 1993, the joke kept resurfacing. Staff began to notice a pattern. The children spoke of Heather's disappearance in connection with a patio being laid. By July, social services were concerned enough to notify police. Inquiries began, quietly, cautiously. No formal allegations had been made, but Heather West was now a person of interest. On February 24th, 1994, Gloucestershire Constabulary obtained a warrant to search the garden at 25 Cromwell Street. The next day, they began excavation. Within hours, they uncovered a human femur beneath the patio, then hair, then more bones. It was Heather. Fred was arrested immediately. Rose was taken into custody days later. What followed was one of the most extensive forensic investigations in British criminal history. Between February 26th and March 8th, 9 sets of human remains were recovered from the cellar and garden. Each body was buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in plastic, and in some cases dismembered. The remains of Shirley Robinson's unborn child were found with her. Fred confessed quickly, but his stories were inconsistent. He claimed responsibility for Heather's murder and for others, including Shirley Robinson and Lina Goff. He insisted Rose was innocent, saying the killings were sex games gone wrong. But forensic evidence and survivor testimony told a different story. One of Fred's claims unravelled almost immediately. He said he killed Charmaine West, his stepdaughter, but records showed Fred was in prison at the time of her death. That meant Rose had murdered Charmaine all alone. Her body was discovered on May 4th, 1994, buried at Midland Road. A forensic comparison of her teeth with a childhood photograph confirmed her identity. The house was dismantled piece by piece. Floorboards were lifted. Concrete was broken. Every inch of the property was examined. The investigation was meticulous, praised later by Justice Mantell as a textbook example of police coordination and forensic precision. Outside, the media descended. Journalists shouted questions over police tape. One reporter asked Fred directly, "What happened to your daughter, Heather?" Fred's reply was chilling. "I haven't murdered my daughter." It wasn't denial. It was deflection. As the evidence mounted, Rose maintained her innocence, but the discovery of Heather's body, her own daughter, beneath the patio of their shared home cast doubt on that claim. How could she have not known? How could she have not seen? The investigation exposed not just the murders, but years of sexual abuse, manipulation, and synthetic failure. Social services had missed warning signs. Police had overlooked earlier allegations, and for over 2 decades, Fred and Rose West had operated undetected. Fred West never stood trial. On New Year's Day 1995, he took his own life in Windsor Green Prison, using strips of a blanket to slowly asphyxiate himself. He left behind a note to Rose, declaring his love and promising to take the blame. But with Fred gone, the legal system faced a new challenge, proving that Rosemary West was not just complicit, but actively involved in the murders. The trial began on October 3rd, 1995, at Winchester Crown Court. Rose West stood accused of 10 accounts of murder. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across the world filled the gallery. The public wanted answers. The family wanted justice. Brian Leveson QC led the prosecution. His strategy was clear. Build a web of circumstantial and forensic evidence that showed Rose was not only present, but instrumental. He described her as the strategist, the dominant partner in a sadistic enterprise. The prosecution relied heavily on similar fact evidence, a legal principle that allows patterns of behaviour to be used to establish guilt. The method used to bind, torture and kill victims were consistent with those used on survivors. The house itself became a witness. The cellar, the bindings, the burial sites, all pointed to a shared modus operandi. One of the most powerful witnesses was Caroline Owens, a former nanny who had escaped the Wests in 1972. She described being abducted, sexually assaulted, and psychologically manipulated. Her voice trembled as she recounted being told she would be killed and buried like the others. She said, "Fred told me they'd done it before, that there were other girls, that no one would find me." Her testimony was graphic, painful, and deeply credible. It showed that Rose was not a passive observer. She was an active participant. Fred's daughter, Anne-Marie, took the stand next. She was composed but visibly shaken. She described years of sexual abuse at the hands of both Fred and Rose. She said Rose would beat her, mock her, and force her into acts she couldn't describe aloud. She told the court, "My mother wasn't just there. She was part of it. She knew what was happening. She made it happen." Her testimony was devastating. It painted Rose not as a manipulated wife, but as a cruel and calculating abuser. Janet Leash was Fred's appropriate adult, appointed to sit on police interviews due to Fred's mental state. Privately, Fred confided in her. He said Rose had killed Charmaine and Shirley Robinson without him. He said they had made a pact. He would take the blame to protect her. Janet was so disturbed by the confession that she later suffered a stroke. She told the court Fred said Rose was worse than him, that she enjoyed it more. Her testimony added a chilling layer to the prosecution's case. Against legal advice, Rose chose to testify. Dressed in black, she appeared cold and defiant. She denied all charges, but under cross-examination, her demeanour shifted. She became angry, evasive, and contradictory. The prosecution used her own words against her. They showed how her reactions mirrored those of guilty party. When Heather's name was mentioned, Rose lowered her head and appeared to cry. But observers weren't convinced. Journalist Paul Stokes later said whether it was play acting or real, it was hard to tell. Richard Ferguson QC led the defence. He argued that Rose was unaware of Fred's actions, that she was a victim of his manipulation, that evidence of sexual assault did not equal evidence of murder. But the jury wasn't persuaded. The consistency of survivor accounts, forensic evidence, and Rose's own behaviour painted a damning picture. The defence played recordings of Fred claiming Rose was innocent. But Fred had lied before, and the jury knew it. On November 22nd, 1995, after 30 days of harrowing testimony and 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned an unanimous verdict. Rose West was found guilty on all 10 accounts of murder. The courtroom fell silent. The judge, Mr. Justice Charles Mantell, addressed her directly. He called her crimes appalling and deprived, and sentenced her to life imprisonment with a whole life tariff, meaning she would never be released. Rose stood motionless as the verdict was read. No tears, no visible reaction. She blinked a few times, then lowered her gaze. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of guilt. She was led from the dock in silence. Outside the courthouse, families of the victims wept. Some embraced, others stood alone, staring at the ground. Reporters scrambled to file their stories. Headlines the next morning would call her Britain's most prolific female serial killer. But for those who had lost daughters, sisters, and friends, the verdict was not closure. It was a confirmation of a nightmare. Justice Mantell praised the jury for their conduct. You will never have had a more important job to do in your life, he said. I am aware of the great stress it must have placed upon you. You deserve my thanks and the country's for the part you have played. Rose's solicitor announced she would appeal the verdict, claiming that media coverage had prejudicated the trial. But the evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimony, forensic findings, and Fred's own confessions had painted a damning picture. Her appeal was later rejected. In prison, Rose remained cold and detached. When informed of Fred's suicide months later, she reportedly blinked and said, "Oh right, no emotion, no grief." According to prison staff, she seemed almost relieved, as if Fred's death had cleared the path for her defence. But the jury had seen through it. Rose West was transferred to HMP Durham, where she joined another infamous inmate, Myra Henley. Later, she was moved to HMP Low Newton, and eventually to HMP New Hall in West Yorkshire. Reports over the years have described her as quiet, compliant, and manipulative. She has never expressed remorse. The sentencing marked the end of the trial, but not end of the story. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. The site remains vacant. No memorials placed. Just silence. And for a family, that silence is permanent. Rose West will die in prison, but the legacy of her crimes and the lives she destroyed will never be forgotten. Fred and Rose West didn't just kill. They manipulated, dominated, and destroyed. Their crimes were sexually motivated, sadistic, and methodically concealed. They operated as a team. One of the rare cases in criminal history where both partners were equally complicit in serial murders. Fred West was a textbook sexual sadist. He deprived pleasure from control, humiliation, and pain. His early life was steeped in dysfunction, poverty and incest and violence. He showed signs of psychopathy, lack of empathy, impulsivity, and a compulsive need to dominate. But he was also charming. He used that charm to lure victims, to silence suspicion, and to manipulate those around him. Rose West, according to forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone, was not simply a follower. She was a psychopath with no consequence, a woman who could have lived a normal life, but instead chose cruelty. She was sexually and physically abused by her father, and that trauma, combined with Fred's influence, created a lethal dynamic. Together, they shared a paraphilic obsession with bondage, rape, and murder. Their relationship was symbolic, each feeding the other's depravity. What's chilling is how they masked it. They raised children, hosted lodges, and maintained a facade of domestic life. They buried bodies beneath floorboards in patio with birthday parties were held upstairs. They lived among the dead, and they did it for over 20 years. Criminal profiler Paul Britton, who consulted on the case, describes the Wests as a unique pairing. He said their crimes weren't just about sexual violence, they were about power. The cellar at 25 Cromwell Street was a theatre of control. Victims were bound, gagged, and tortured. Fred used breathing tubes to prolong suffering. Rose participated actively, sometimes initiating the abuse. They filmed it. They kept trophies. They relieved it. Fred's need for dominance was compulsive. Rose's cruelty was calculated. She beat her children, mocked victims, and showed no remorse. Survivors described her as more violent than Fred, more unpredictable. She wasn't coerced. She was committed. 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The site remains vacant. No memorial was placed, just silence. The house had become too infamous, too contaminated by its history. Today, it exists only in photographs, court records, and in memories of those who survived. But the legacy of the case goes far beyond the bricks and mortar. It exposes deep failure in social services, law enforcement, and child protection. Multiple opportunities to intervene were missed. Complaints were dismissed. Children were ignored. The Wests operated in plain sight, and no one stopped them. In response, reforms were introduced. child protection protocols were strengthened. Missing person investigations became more rigorous. The case became a benchmark, a warning of what happens when systems fail. Fred and Rose West became symbols of domestic horror. Their story has been the subject of documentaries, books, and psychological studies. But for the families of the victims, it's not a story, it's a wound. And for those of us who remember the headlines, the excavations, and the trial, it's a reminder evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it lives next door. We've just walked through one of the darkest corridors in British criminal history, from the quiet beginnings in Herefordshire and Devon, to the horrors buried beneath 25 Cromwell Street. Fred and Rose West left behind a legacy of pain, silence, and unanswered questions. Over 2 decades, they murdered at least 12 young women and girls. Some were strangers, some were family, all were vulnerable, and all were failed. By the people who should have protected them, by the systems that missed the signs, and by the silence that allowed the Wests to operate unchecked. We've heard from survivors, women who escaped the house of horrors and found the courage to speak. We've followed the investigation, the trial, and the verdict that brought Rose West to justice. And we looked into the minds of 2 people whose cruelty defied comprehension. I remember when this case broke. I was living in Staffordshire. The headlines were relentless. The disbelief was real. And even now, decades later, that story still haunts us. Because it wasn't just about murder. It was about control, manipulation, and the terrifying ability of evil to hide behind a smile, a front door, and a family name. 25 Cromwell Street is gone, demolished, erased from the landscape, but the memory remains, and so does the responsibility to listen, to protect, and never let silence win. This has been 25 Cromwell Street, the Fred and Rose West case. You've been listening to Disturbing Truths. I'm Andrew. Stay safe, stay aware, and stay with me. We'll be back next week with another case, another reckoning, and another story that deserves to be told.